Shalom Havraim, James Trim here, and today I want to talk to you about the apocryphal book known as the Wisdom of Solomon. This is a book found in the books known as the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha are books that were actually taken out of your Bible. And I want to address this particular book and some information as to the authenticity of the book from a Jewish perspective. And I'm doing this kind of and about the Hebrew origin of this book. I'm doing this as a preface, if you will, because in the future I'll be doing a couple of videos that will involve messianic prophecies that are found in this book. Very important messianic prophecies. Okay, so before we get started, I want to remind everybody to please donate by clicking on the donate button. We don't have any other sponsors but you. And we depend on you, those that benefit from these videos, to be our sponsors. So click on the donate button. I think you'll find this material in our videos is unique, and therefore I'm also going to recommend that you subscribe to these videos. We're trying to get up over to 3,000 subscribers. We're very close. We're at 2.9 thousand subscribers, 2,900 and something, and we're trying to get up to at least 3,000 subscribers. And that way you'll also get notifications when more videos come out. Also, don't forget to like this video. You can donate by sending donations by PayPal, to donations@wnae.org, or as I said, you can click on the donate link in the video description. There are also handouts for this video in PDF form, and there is a link where you can download those PDF handouts in the video description as well. So like I said, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, let us know what you think about our videos in the comments, and of course share our videos on social media with your friends. All right, so let's talk about this book, The Wisdom of Solomon. As I said, this is a book that is found in the Apocrypha, which are a group of books that are that frankly were removed from your Bibles. Let me explain what I mean by that. The books known as the Apocrypha, I'm not talking about the pseudepigrapha, but the books known as the Apocrypha, these are a group of books that are, in some Protestant Bibles, they appear in an appendix titled Apocrypha. These were, Protestants moved them to an appendix in the back of the book and then eventually removed them entirely. Most of these books, known as the Apocrypha, including the Wisdom of Solomon, appear in Catholic Bibles. By Catholic, I mean Roman Catholic, the Ethiopic Orthodox Church, their Bibles, in the Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox Church, in their Bibles. This book is The Wisdom of Solomon appears in the Syrian Orthodox and Assyrian Church of the East. It's the Wisdom of Solomon and the Apocrypha. For the most of the Apocrypha are also in their Bibles, and in fact, these books, including the Wisdom of Solomon, were part of the canon of the Septuagint Greek version. They were part of the canon of the Peshitta Aramaic version, and most, if not all, ancient versions of the Bible. They're not part of the Masoretic text, but the Masoretic text didn't appear until the Middle Ages. Many of them were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so As I said, these books were originally, Protestants initially moved them to the back of the book into an appendix titled Apocrypha. Now they did this because these books didn't appear in the Masoretic text, but the Masoretic text didn't appear until the Middle Ages. So basically, that they only moved them; they didn't remove them until later. In fact, these books of the Apocrypha, with the exception of 3rd and 4th Maccabees and Psalm 151, but the majority of these books appeared in the 1611 King James Version of the Bible in such an appendix, which is going to be important in our discussion later on. And they were part of the original 1611 King James Version of the Bible. If you get a replica of the 1611 King James Version, you will find them. If you get a Bible that says authorized 1611 version and it doesn't have these books, it's a lie. It's not an authorized 1611 edition, because the 1611 edition contained these books. Also, if it has the letter J instead of I's everywhere where the J would be, it's also not an authorized 1611 version, because the 1611 version had no J. The J didn't exist in the English language in 1611 and was not in the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. Instead, there was an I wherever we see a J. So let's talk now about the wisdom of Solomon. According to a writer named Melito in the 2nd century CE, he claimed that the wisdom of Solomon in his day was considered canonical by both Jews and Christians. The so-called church fathers cited the books of the Apocrypha, including the wisdom of Solomon, right alongside the others as quote-unquote scripture. And in fact, the wisdom of Solomon is also cited. I'm not going to cite the references in this video. We may do so in a future video on that subject, but it's also used by Paul and James Yaakov, I believe, uses it as well. But it is referenced paraphrased or quoted in the so-called New Testament. Okay, one of the great rabbinic commentators is Ramban, or Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, and he lived in the 13th century. Actually, he was born at the very end of the 12th century, but he lived and wrote in the 13th century. He wrote one of the most authoritative Torah commentaries in rabbinic Judaism, and in his introduction to his commentary to the Torah, Ramban quotes an Aramaic version of the Wisdom of Solomon and takes the quotations that he cites as the authentic words of Solomon, that Solomon actually wrote the book. Quoting Ramban, he says, and this is in our handout, Authenticity of the Wisdom of Solomon. Quoting Ramban, he says, King Solomon, peace be upon him, whom God had given wisdom and knowledge, derived it all from the Torah, and from it he studied until he knew the secret of all things created, even in the forces and characteristics of plants, so that he wrote about them even a book of medicine, as it is written. And he spoke of trees from the cedar that in Lebanon, even unto the hyssop that springs out of the wall. In 1 Kings 5:13. Now I have seen, this is Ramban speaking or writing, now I have seen the Aramaic translation of the book called The Great Wisdom of Solomon, and in it is written, quote, There is nothing new in the birth of a king or ruler. There is one entrance for all people into the world and one exit alike. Therefore I have prayed, and the spirit of wisdom was given to me, and I have called out, and the spirit of knowledge came to me. I chose it above scepter and throne. He's actually quoting from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verses 3 through 8. He goes on to say, and it is further stated, it is God alone who gives knowledge that contains no falsehood, enabling one to know how the world arose, the composition of the constellations, and the beginning, the end, and the middle of times, the angles of the ends of the constellations, and how the seasons are produced by the movement of the heavens, and the fixed position of the stars, the benign nature of cattle and the fierceness of beasts, the power of the wind and the thoughts of man, the relationship of trees and the forces of roots, everything hidden and everything revealed I know. This is Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verses 17 through 21 that he's quoted. Get this. Then he says, and this is Ramban saying this, all this Solomon knew from the Torah, and he found everything in it. It is simple meanings, in its simple meanings, and the subtleties of its expressions, and its letters and its strokes, as I have mentioned. So Ramban is here expressing his belief. One of the great Jewish commentators is expressing his belief that this book, The Wisdom of Solomon, was actually written by Solomon. You can't escape that conclusion when he says quotes the book and says all of this Solomon knew from the Torah. So he is expressing that this is authentically written by Solomon. Now, notice he refers to the fact that he's read an Aramaic translation of the book. And I would submit that in his time, this would have had to have referred to the Aramaic Peshitta version of the Wisdom of Solomon. And I want to talk about that version and the Hebrew origin of the book, because many of the skeptic scholars today claim that the Wisdom of Solomon was written in Greek. The Hebrew has been lost. We don't have the Hebrew anymore. And since the Hebrew is missing, it's very easy for scholars to say that it was written in Greek. They also like to find ideas in it that they then want to dismiss as Greek ideas, like the concept of the four virtues. Okay, so they want to dismiss these things as Greek ideas from a late forgery attributed to Solomon. But as I said, Ramban was convinced that it was the authentic work of Solomon himself. Okay, so I want to talk about, remember I said that these books of the Apocrypha, including the Wisdom of Solomon, appeared in the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. Now what's really interesting is that the 1611 King James Version of the Wisdom of Solomon has a marginal note. Okay, the 1611 King James Version of the Bible actually included marginal notes, and it has a marginal note. In your handout, the title of the next page of handouts, on the handouts, by the way, is The Hebrew Origin of the Wisdom of Solomon, and I included a close-up picture, a close-up facsimile of the original 1611 King James Version of the Bible printing of the page that contains the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 16, verse 11. Now, it's an interesting coincidence that this is chapter 16, verse 11, and we're talking about the 1611 edition. It's completely coincidence. There's no typo or misstatement. We are talking about Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 16, verse 11. There is a marginal note, and I don't know why scholars ignore this fact, because it's very difficult to find. Nobody seems to refer to this fact. Academia just seemed to dismiss the Wisdom of Solomon as having been written in Greek, and never address the fact that the 1611 version of the King James Version of the Bible has a marginal note here to the text of its translation of the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 16, verse 11, and it says, and you can see it right there for yourself, it's to the word pricked in chapter 16, verse 11, where it says, "For they were pricked that they would not remember your words," or thy words. And there is a marginal note marker here, and in the margin it says HEBR period, which no doubt is Hebrew. And then it says stung. Now I know it looks like an F of some kind. That's the old way they used to write an S. It's stung, S-T-U-N-G. So it's offering an alternate translation from the original Hebrew, and that alternate translation from the original Hebrew is stung. Now, that's very interesting, because what that tells us is that as recently as 1611, just 400 years ago, recently in the grand scheme of things, if you will, the King James translators had access to the original Hebrew text of Wisdom of Solomon that's now since been lost. We don't have it today. Maybe a copy of it will turn up somewhere, because it did exist as recently as 1611, and I'm going to prove that as we continue. By the way, just a little note here. The modern scholars also ignore the fact that the book of First Esdras in the Apocrypha in the 1611 King James Version has several instances where it has marginal notes referencing the original Hebrew and giving an alternate reading, despite the fact that modern scholars like to insist that First Esdras was originally written in Greek, and it appears that it was originally written in Hebrew, and the original Hebrew survived into 1611 and was referenced by the KJV translators. Okay, so the Greek word here, looking at chapter 16, verse 11 of the Wisdom of Solomon, the Greek word that appears where the KJV has pricked is an enekentronto. I'm not a Greek expert, but enekentronto, meaning they were pricked in the KJV and in the Brenton translation, or they were bitten, as it reads in the Revised Standard Version in the New English Bible, and the New American Bible has they were stung. And of course, this word can be translated stung, as it is in the New American Bible, but it can also be translated pricked, as in the King James Version in the main text. So the KJV marginal note indicates that the original Hebrew doesn't have, in fact, or did in fact have a word that meant sting or stung here, in the past tense, stung. The KJV footnote or marginal note, more correctly, would seem to indicate that the original Hebrew word had to have been parash. Parash. That's Strong's number 6567. I don't recommend Strong's Concordance, but there are a number of sources, like there are editions of Jacinius, for example, lexicon, that are keyed to Strong's Concordance, so it's a helpful word number to have. And to distinguish it, it's the only biblical Hebrew word for sting or stung. And we see it used for that in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 32. It's the only biblical Hebrew word that means that. So it has to be the underlying Hebrew that the 1611 King James Version is telling us in its marginal note must have appeared there. So we have one Hebrew word of the original Hebrew text of this of the Wisdom of Solomon, implicitly preserved for us in this marginal note by the KJV translators, who did in fact apparently have the Hebrew text in front of them to make a marginal note referencing the Hebrew and saying that it has stung. Okay. Now here's where it gets interesting, and this is all, for the most part, this is original research that I'm sharing with you. When I did my own comparison, I thought, I'm going to go look and see what the Peshitta Aramaic text has here, where the for pricked or stung, and the Aramaic translator has in Aramaic patzait, split or opened. So the Aramaic translator translates it not as pricked or stung, but as split or opened. And that's very important because there is another Hebrew word that is actually spelled with the same Hebrew letters, Peresh Shin in Hebrew, spells parash, okay, which is Strong 6567, sting, which is the word that has to appear here, or had to have appeared here, based upon the marginal note referring to the Hebrew in the 1611 KJV. Parash. Okay? Those very same letters in the unpointed Hebrew, but instead of sheen, it's seen, peresh seen, paras, which is Strong 6566. That Hebrew word does not mean sting or stung or pricked. That Hebrew word, which in unpointed Hebrew looks exactly like parash, is paras, means to break in pieces. It's Strong's number 6566 as opposed to Strong's 6567. So Strong 6566 is paras, and Strong 6567 is parash. Parash means sting and or prick, and paras means to break in pieces. So when the Peshitta Aramaic translation has patzeit, split open, or split or opened, it had to have been translated from the Hebrew, not the Greek, and from the original Hebrew that the KJV is telling us appeared here. So there's so much information that we derive from this incidental marginal note that the KJV translators preserved for us. That one, that there was a Hebrew text, original Hebrew text. Two, that original Hebrew text still existed in 1611, and that the KJV translators had it available to them and referenced it in making this marginal note. Three, because there is only one biblical Hebrew word that can mean stung or sting in the present tense, and that is parash. The Hebrew word that appeared there had to have been parash, based upon the testimony of the KJV marginal note. we get verification of that and further information from the fact that the Aramaic Peshitta translation mistranslates that word with the Aramaic patzait, which means to split or open, split or opened, which is the meaning of a look-alike Hebrew word, a Hebrew word that looks identical in unpointed Hebrew. And in pointed Hebrew, the dot it's the difference between a sheen and a seen. And if you're learning biblical Hebrew, the best way to remember, a little memory device I was taught when I was learning Hebrew, is sin is never right. So if the dot is over the far right prong of the sheen, it's a sheen. And if it's over the far left, it's a seen. Because seen or sin is never right. Okay, so the Aramaic Peshitta translator saw Pei Resh Shin and thought it was paras. They thought it was the Hebrew word paras, meaning to break in pieces, when in fact it was actually the Hebrew word parash, to sting. And so we get this mistranslation in the Aramaic Peshitta. But this tells us something very important. It tells us that the Aramaic Peshitta was translated not from the Greek version of the Wisdom of Solomon, but from the lost original Hebrew version of the Wisdom of Solomon. That's extremely useful information because the Aramaic and Hebrew are cognate languages. They use the same 22-letter alphabet. In fact, in Jewish Aramaic, if you will, in the Aramaic of the Babylonian Talmud and the Zohar and the Targums, Aramaic is actually written with the same 22, literally the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. But even Syriac Aramaic is still written with the same 22 letters. They just look differently. Okay? But they're the same 22 letters. Also, they're based upon the same three-letter Semitic roots, or many of the same three-letter roots, and therefore they have many of the same vocabulary, or very similar vocabulary. For example, in Hebrew it's shalom, in Aramaic shlama. In Hebrew we have gamel for camel, and in Aramaic it's gamla for camel, and so on. Okay, so they're very similar languages. Their grammar is also very similar. If supplied with the knowledge that the Peshitta Aramaic version of the Wisdom of Solomon had to have been translated from the Hebrew and not from the Greek Septuagint version, then we have a very good witness, although admittedly in Wisdom of Solomon 16:11, a mistranslation, but that beautiful mistranslation, if you will, in and of itself tells us that we are looking at a literal Aramaic translation of the original Hebrew, not a translation of the Greek, which is very important because Greek and Hebrew are completely different languages. But Aramaic and Hebrew are so similar that when you're looking at an Aramaic text, you can virtually see the Hebrew text behind it much more clearly than if you're looking at a Greek translation trying to look at the Hebrew translation behind it. So, beautiful information here. First of all, Ramban believed that first of all, Melito testified that in the 2nd century, both Jews and Christians believed the Wisdom of Solomon was canonical. Ramban testified that he believed that he not only used the book, but that he believed it was originally written by Solomon, that its words were Solomon's words. And then we find out that in 1611, the King James Version, the King James translators, had access to the original Hebrew, which has since been lost, and gave an alternate translation in the margin to one of the verses, to one of the words in one of the verses, to chapter 16, verse 11, in the margin, that tells us and reveals to us what the underlying Hebrew word there had to have been. And when we then compare that with the Peshitta Aramaic version, we find irrefutable evidence that the Peshitta Aramaic version of Wisdom of Solomon is a literal Aramaic translation made directly from the original Hebrew, lost Hebrew of this book, and not from a from the Greek Septuagint translation. So we have a very good witness to the original Hebrew in the Aramaic Peshitta version, which is, by the way, apparently the very version that Ramban is making reference to that he had read. So in closing, the Wisdom of Solomon, contrary to what you may read elsewhere, I think we have demonstrated conclusively here with original research, with irrefutable information, that the Wisdom of Solomon was originally written in Hebrew, that it was used by Jews and Christians both as canonical in the 2nd century, that Ramban, the great rabbinic commentator Ramban, believed that it was an authentic, original, authentic work of Solomon, that it was actually the words of Solomon authentically, that the KJV translators in 1611 had access to the Hebrew, and that based upon their marginal note, that when compared with the Aramaic Peshitta, that the Aramaic Peshitta text of the Wisdom of Solomon gives us a literal Aramaic translation of the Hebrew, giving us a very, very good idea of the original Hebrew of this book, which has since been lost. Where do you get information like this? This is original cutting-edge research. So I'm going to ask you to please donate to support this work. We recently discovered that we have lost a major source of income. So we really need your support now more than ever. You can donate by sending donations to donations at wnae.org, or by clicking on the donate link in the video description. Also, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this channel, share these videos with your friends on social media, and let us know what you think about this information, this cutting edge research and information in the video description. Until next time, shalom.